Every Friday evening, just before sunset, a lonely cowboy walked into a small flower shop in Willow Creek, Montana. He was always dressed the same way, a faded brown cowboy hat, worn denim jacket, dusty boots, and dark jeans. His face carried the quiet sadness of a man who had spent years learning how to live with loss. Without looking around, he would walk to the counter and ask for 12 white roses. The florist, a kind woman in her early 30s, had served him for nearly a year. He never explained who received the flowers. He simply paid, thanked her softly, and disappeared into the evening. At first, the florist thought the cowboy was buying flowers for a girlfriend. Then she imagined perhaps he had a secret admirer or an elderly mother somewhere outside town. But every Friday, without exception, he returned. Rain, snow, or bright sunshine never changed his routine. He always bought exactly 12 white roses. One Friday evening, as he reached for his wallet, the florist finally gathered enough courage to ask, "Who are they for?" The cowboy stopped moving. His fingers remained on the edge of his wallet while his eyes slowly dropped toward the roses. For several seconds, he said nothing. Then he quietly replied, "Someone I lost a long time ago." The florist immediately regretted asking. "I'm sorry," she whispered. "You don't have to explain." But the cowboy surprised her by staying. He gently touched one of the roses and said his wife's name was Sarah. They had met when they were teenagers and married young. Sarah had loved wildflowers, horses, and Friday evenings more than anything. Every Friday after work, they would sit on the porch of their small ranch, share dinner, and talk until the stars filled the sky. 6 years earlier, Sarah had been driving home from town when another vehicle crossed the highway. The accident took her life instantly. The cowboy survived his grief, but he never truly escaped it. Before Sarah died, she had once teased him about being too serious. She had told him that if she ever left before him, he wasn't allowed to spend the rest of his life sitting alone in darkness. "If you miss me," she had said, "buy me flowers every Friday." At the time, he had laughed and promised he would. After her death, those words became a sacred promise. Every Friday, he bought 12 white roses and carried them somewhere no one knew about. The florist listened silently as he explained, her heart aching for the stranger standing before her. When he finished, she asked, "Where do you take them?" The cowboy looked toward the shop window where the last orange light of sunset was disappearing behind the mountains. "I can't tell you," he said gently. Then he picked up the roses and walked outside. The florist watched him climb into an old pickup truck parked beside the road. Something about his expression stayed with her. It wasn't only sadness anymore. There was also devotion, as though he were keeping a promise that mattered more than his own happiness. For almost a year, she had wondered who those flowers were for. Now she understood that the answer was much deeper than she expected. Still, one question remained unanswered. The following Friday, the florist found herself waiting for the cowboy before he even entered the shop. She had spent the entire week thinking about his story and wondering where he took those 12 white roses. When the familiar pickup finally stopped outside, he walked in wearing the same brown cowboy hat and faded denim jacket. 12 roses, he said. The florist prepared them carefully. Before he could leave, she smiled and said, "I won't ask where you're going." The cowboy nodded gratefully, but this time he hesitated. "Maybe you should know," he whispered. "There's something I've never told anyone in this town." They drove together toward the edge of Willow Creek, where the paved road became a narrow dirt trail. The cowboy finally stopped beside an old wooden farmhouse surrounded by tall grass. The house looked abandoned, but someone had recently cleared the walkway. He carried the flowers to the porch and placed them beside the door. The florist stared at him, confused. "I thought Sarah was buried at the cemetery." He looked down. "She is." These aren't for Sarah." The florist's eyes widened. The cowboy explained that Sarah's mother, Margaret, lived in the house. After Sarah's death, Margaret had fallen into deep loneliness and stopped speaking to almost everyone. The cowboy had promised Sarah that he would never let her mother feel completely alone. Every Friday, he left 12 white roses at Margaret's door. He never knocked because Margaret didn't know he was doing it. He was afraid she might recognize him and remember the terrible day her daughter died. The florist looked at the cowboy with new respect. "You've been taking care of her all these years?" she asked. He nodded. "Sarah asked me to take care of the people she loved. I couldn't save her, but I could keep one. Promise?" The florist gently touched his arm. "You don't have to do it alone anymore." For the first time, the cowboy smiled. The next Friday, the florist came with him again. This time, they knocked on the door. An elderly woman opened it slowly. She looked at the roses, then at the cowboy. Her eyes immediately filled with tears. "It was you," she whispered. The cowboy lowered his head. Margaret had known all along. She had recognized his truck and his boots, but had been too afraid to open the door. She pulled him into a trembling embrace. For several minutes, neither spoke. The florist stood nearby with tears in her eyes. Margaret eventually invited them inside. That evening, they drank coffee, shared old stories about Sarah, and laughed for the first time in years. After that night, everything changed. The cowboy no longer visited Margaret secretly. Every Friday, he and the florist brought flowers, groceries, and sometimes fresh bread. Margaret slowly became happier. The cowboy also began smiling again. One evening, while they were sitting on Margaret's porch, he looked at the florist and realized something frightening and beautiful. He had spent 6 years believing that loving someone new would betray Sarah's memory, but Sarah had never wanted him to remain alone. She had wanted him to live. A few weeks later, the cowboy entered the flower shop carrying a single white rose. The florist smiled and asked, "Who is that one for?" He placed it gently in her hand and answered, "For the woman who helped me understand that my heart still has room for love." She smiled through her tears, and that Friday, the lonely cowboy finally went home with someone beside him.